He abandoned his dog at the side of the road, but the dog walked miles to find him again. The rain drizzled steadily against the windshield, creating blurry streaks of light from the distant lampposts. Mark tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale and tense. He hadn't said a word since leaving the house, and the silence inside the car was deafening. Beside him, Buddy sat in the passenger seat, his golden fur shimmering faintly in the glow of the dashboard lights. His tail wagged softly, a sign of his trust, his eyes watching Mark with innocent curiosity. Mark's chest felt heavy, as if a weight pressed down on his ribs with every breath he took. The dog had no idea what was about to happen, and that made it even harder. "This is the right thing to do," Mark muttered under his breath, more to convince himself than anything. He glanced at Buddy, who tilted his head slightly at the sound of his voice. Buddy had been his constant companion for the past 5 years, through all the ups and downs. He had been there during the late nights after his wife, Emily, passed away in a car accident. He had stayed by Mark's side when grief consumed him, pressing his head into Mark's lap as if to absorb his sadness. Buddy had been there when Mark lost his job at the factory, sitting at his feet while he sifted through rejection emails. But now, as Mark spiraled deeper into financial ruin, the thought of caring for Buddy felt like yet another burden. The bills were piling up, his fridge was nearly empty, and eviction notices had started appearing on his door. He could barely feed himself, let alone a dog. "This isn't a life for you," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "You deserve better." The car came to a slow stop on the side of a desolate road. The rain had subsided, leaving behind a damp chill in the air. Mark put the car in park and sat there for a moment, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. Buddy's ears perked up as he looked around, his tail thumping against the seat. Mark reached over and scratched Buddy behind the ears, his fingers lingering in the soft fur. "You're gonna be okay, boy," he said, his throat tightening. "Someone will find you. Someone who can take care of you better than I can." Buddy leaned into Mark's touch, unaware of the gravity of the moment. Mark opened the car door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. Buddy followed, hopping out of the car and sniffing the air. The vast emptiness of the road stretched out before them, with no signs of life in sight. Mark walked around to the passenger side and knelt down, his heart pounding in his chest. He held Buddy's face in his hands, looking into those warm, trusting eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely able to get the words out. Buddy licked Mark's hand, his tail wagging as if to say, "It's okay, I trust you." Mark stood up abruptly, unable to look at him any longer. He walked back to the driver's side, his steps hurried and uneven. Buddy trotted behind him, his tail wagging in playful confusion. When Mark opened the car door, Buddy tried to jump back in, but Mark gently pushed him back. "No, Buddy, stay here," he said, his voice shaking. Buddy tilted his head, his ears flicking forward as he tried to understand what was happening. Mark climbed into the car and closed the door, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. He started the engine, the rumble breaking the stillness of the night. Buddy barked once, his tail wagging, as if expecting Mark to let him back in. Mark looked straight ahead, refusing to meet Buddy's gaze. With a deep breath, he pressed down on the gas pedal and drove away. In the rearview mirror, Mark could see Buddy running after the car, his golden fur shining under the faint moonlight. The sight tore through him like a blade, but he didn't slow down. He gritted his teeth, his vision blurred by tears, and kept driving. "This is for the best," he said to himself, the words hollow and unconvincing. By the time Mark pulled into his driveway, the house felt emptier than ever. He turned off the engine and sat in silence, his head resting against the steering wheel. The rain had started again, pattering softly against the roof of the car. Inside, the house was quiet, almost oppressively so. Buddy's bed sat untouched in the corner of the living room, and his favorite toy, a worn-out tennis ball, lay next to it. Mark picked up the ball and turned it over in his hands, his chest tightening with guilt. For the first time in years, the house felt too quiet, too still, and for the first time in years, Mark felt completely alone. He sat down on the couch, the tennis ball still in his hand. Memories flooded his mind, Buddy chasing the ball across the yard, bringing it back with his tail wagging furiously, Buddy curling up beside him on the couch during stormy nights, his presence a comforting weight. Buddy's bark of excitement whenever Mark walked through the door. Mark buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "What have I done?" he whispered. Meanwhile, Buddy stood alone on the side of the road, the car's red taillights disappearing into the distance. The rain had started again, soaking his golden fur. He barked once, then twice, but no one answered. For a moment, he stood still, his tail drooping. But then, as if fueled by an unshakable instinct, Buddy turned in the direction of the car and started walking. The road stretched out before him, dark and endless, but Buddy didn't hesitate. He had made up his mind. He was going to find his way back home. The cold asphalt pressed against Buddy's paws as he trotted down the empty road. The faint scent of Mark's car lingered in the air, and Buddy's nose twitched as he followed it with unwavering determination. The rain had slowed to a mist, clinging to his golden fur, but the chill didn't deter him. His instincts, sharpened by years of bonding with Mark, told him one thing: keep going. The road was eerily quiet. The tall trees on either side loomed like shadowy sentinels, their leaves rustling in the soft breeze. Occasionally, the sound of a distant car echoed in the distance, but Buddy remained focused, his head low and his tail wagging faintly as he trudged forward. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Buddy had covered several miles. His legs ached, and his once fluffy coat was now matted with dirt. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he didn't stop. The faint smell of Mark's car was still there, like a thread connecting him to the only home he had ever known. As the sun rose higher, the world around Buddy began to wake up. A few cars passed him on the road, their drivers glancing curiously at the lone dog walking with such purpose. One car slowed down, a woman rolling down her window. "Hey boy, are you lost?" she called out, her voice kind. Buddy paused for a moment, his ears flicking toward her. The woman stepped out of the car and knelt down, holding out a piece of bread from her lunch bag. "Come here, sweetie," she coaxed. Buddy hesitated. His nose twitched at the scent of food, and his stomach growled loudly. But something inside him told him to keep moving. He let out a soft whine, his eyes full of regret, and then turned away, trotting back onto the road. The woman watched him go, her heart aching for the determined dog. She climbed back into her car, shaking her head. "I hope he finds what he's looking for," she murmured as she drove away. As the day wore on, Buddy faced his first real obstacle: hunger. The sun was high in the sky now, beating down on the asphalt and making the road uncomfortably hot. Buddy veered off into the grass where the earth was cooler. He stopped by a small stream, dipping his head to drink deeply. The water was refreshing, giving him a brief moment of relief. Nearby, a squirrel darted across the grass, catching Buddy's attention. For a moment he considered chasing it, the primal urge of a hunter sparking in his mind. But the thought passed quickly. He couldn't afford to waste energy. Instead, Buddy continued along the stream, hoping it might lead him to food. His sharp nose picked up the faint scent of something familiar: trash. Buddy's search led him to a small picnic area by the stream, where the remains of someone's lunch lay scattered on the ground. He sniffed around, finding a half-eaten sandwich still wrapped in its paper. Grateful, he devoured it quickly, the bread and bits of ham soothing the ache in his stomach. But even as he ate, his thoughts were on Mark. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to follow the faint scent that lingered in the air. So, with his hunger momentarily sated, Buddy set off again. As the evening approached, Buddy's journey took him through a quiet neighborhood. The smell of barbecues and freshly cut grass filled the air, a stark contrast to the desolate road he had traveled earlier. Children played in their yards, their laughter carrying on the wind. One little girl spotted Buddy and ran up to him, her pigtails bouncing. "Doggy!" she squealed, her hands reaching out to pet him. Buddy stopped, his tail wagging slightly. The girl's touch was gentle, and for a brief moment, he felt a flicker of comfort. But when the girl's mother called out from the porch, Buddy turned and trotted away, his mission pulling him forward. "Mommy, why is he leaving?" the girl asked, her eyes wide. "Maybe he's going home," the mother replied, watching the dog disappear down the street. That night, Buddy found himself back on the open road. The stars blinked down at him from a clear sky, their light guiding him as he pressed on. His legs were weaker now, his steps slower, but he refused to stop. At one point, he came across an old barn on the edge of a field. The scent of hay and animals was inviting, and Buddy pushed his way through the slightly open door. Inside, the air was warm and dry, a welcome respite from the cold night outside. Buddy curled up on a pile of hay, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. As he drifted off to sleep, images of Mark filled his mind. Mark tossing a ball for him to fetch, Mark laughing as Buddy rolled over for belly rubs, Mark's hand resting gently on his head. Buddy's tail wagged faintly in his sleep, as if reassuring himself that he was still on the right path. By the time dawn broke, Buddy was back on the road, his determination as strong as ever. He didn't know how far he still had to go, but he knew one thing for certain. He would find his way back to Mark no matter what it took. Você tem razão novamente. Vou expandir Chapter 3 para atingir as 1.200 palavras estimadas, adicionando mais detalhes às cenas emocionais, os flashbacks de Mark com Buddy, e explorando com mais profundidade o impacto da solidão e do arrependimento no protagonista. Aqui está o capítulo revisado e expandido. Mark sat in the same spot on his worn-out couch, staring blankly at the tennis ball in his hand. His thumb traced the scuffed surface of the ball, worn smooth in patches from countless games of fetch with Buddy. The silence in the house was overwhelming, pressing in on him like a suffocating weight. For 5 years, Buddy's presence had filled every corner of the house, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors, his tail thumping against the couch, and his happy barks echoing in the yard. Now, it was as if the life had been drained from the home. He tossed the ball across the room. It rolled to a stop beside Buddy's empty bed, sitting in the corner like a monument to the life Mark had given up. He stared at it for a long moment, expecting, hoping, to hear the familiar sound of Buddy's paws padding across the floor to retrieve it. But there was only silence. Mark ran a hand through his unkempt hair, his shoulders slumping under the weight of regret. "I did the right thing," he muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow. "I didn't have a choice." But as the hours dragged on, the silence became unbearable. He could still hear the faint echo of Buddy's bark in his mind, the way the dog's eyes had looked up at him as if to say, "I trust you." The memory cut deeper than he cared to admit. The days that followed blurred together into an endless loop of emptiness. Mark moved through his house like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping. He ignored the stack of unopened bills piling up on the kitchen counter, their bright red warnings screaming for his attention. At night, the memories haunted him. He saw Buddy sitting by the front door, wagging his tail whenever Mark came home. He saw Buddy lying on the rug, resting his head on Mark's feet during the quiet evenings, and he saw Buddy's face in the rearview mirror that night on the road, the confusion, the desperation, and the trust that Mark had so brutally betrayed. Each memory felt like a punch to the gut, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape them. One sleepless night, Mark found himself pacing the living room, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a vice. The air in the house felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the silence was deafening. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the kitchen cabinet and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass like a bitter reminder of his mistakes. He took a long sip, the alcohol burning his throat, but it did little to numb the ache in his chest. His gaze drifted to the empty space where Buddy's bed used to be. He had moved it to the garage earlier that day, thinking it would help him forget. But it hadn't. Mark sank into the couch, the glass trembling in his hand. "I was just trying to do what was best for him," he murmured to himself, though the words felt like lies. As the days turned into weeks, Mark's health began to deteriorate. He skipped meals, his appetite replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. His clothes hung looser on his frame, and the dark circles under his eyes deepened with each sleepless night. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch steps, he found himself clutching an old photo album. Dust had settled on the cover, a testament to how long it had been since he'd opened it. With trembling hands, he flipped through the pages, each photograph a snapshot of happier times. There was Emily, his late wife, holding Buddy as a puppy. Her smile was radiant, her laughter practically echoing off the glossy paper. There was Buddy chasing a frisbee in the park, his ears flopping comically as he bounded after it. And there was Mark himself, sitting by a campfire with Buddy at his side, the dog's head resting on his knee in perfect contentment. Mark's fingers lingered on that photo, his vision blurring with tears. He could almost feel the warmth of Buddy's head against his leg, the quiet companionship they had shared on that trip. "I promised to take care of you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I promised." The guilt surged like a tidal wave, and Mark slammed the photo album shut, burying his face in his hands. That night, Mark's decline reached its peak. He lay sprawled on the couch, his body weak and his mind consumed by a relentless storm of regret and grief. He hadn't eaten in days, and his energy was nearly gone. The house was pitch black, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Mark stared at the ceiling, his thoughts spiraling into darkness. He thought about Emily, about the life they had built together, and about how everything had fallen apart after she was gone. He thought about Buddy, the one constant in his life, and how he had abandoned him in the cruelest way. A single tear slid down his cheek as he whispered into the emptiness, "I don't deserve him. I don't deserve anything." As his vision blurred and his breathing slowed, Mark's grip on consciousness began to fade. The last image in his mind was Buddy's face, the golden fur, the bright eyes, the unwavering loyalty that Mark had taken for granted. But Buddy wasn't gone. Miles away, the golden retriever was still on the road, his determination unshaken. Every step was a testament to the bond they shared, a bond that distance and betrayal couldn't break. And deep inside, Mark felt a flicker of hope, a faint but undeniable feeling that Buddy wasn't giving up on him. The wind howled through the open fields as Buddy trudged onward, his legs heavy with exhaustion. Each step sent a dull ache through his paws, now raw and cracked from days of walking. The golden retriever's once glossy coat was matted with dirt, his body thinner than it had ever been. But despite the hunger gnawing at his belly and the pain coursing through his limbs, Buddy pressed on, driven by an instinct deeper than survival, an unyielding bond with Mark. The scent of Mark's car had grown faint, almost imperceptible now, but Buddy's determination hadn't wavered. His nose twitched as he sniffed the cool night air, hoping for any sign that he was heading in the right direction. The road ahead stretched into darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of headlights from passing cars. Buddy stayed close to the edge, the tall grass brushing against his side as he moved. Each rumble of an engine made his ears perk up, but none of the vehicles slowed for the lone dog walking the empty road. By morning, Buddy reached a small gas station, its fluorescent lights flickering against the dawn sky. The scent of food and fuel filled the air, and Buddy's nose twitched as he caught the faint aroma of grilled meat from a nearby diner. His stomach growled loudly, but he hesitated, standing on the outskirts of the parking lot. A truck driver noticed him and stepped out of his vehicle, a half-eaten sandwich in hand. "Hey, Buddy," the man called, crouching down and holding out the sandwich. Buddy stared at the man, his tail wagging faintly. Hunger urged him forward, but something in him hesitated. He took a cautious step closer, his nose twitching at the scent of the food. "Come on, boy," the man coaxed, his voice soft. "You look like you've had a rough time." Buddy took another step, then stopped. The man's kind eyes reminded him of Mark, but the memory also sharpened the pain of betrayal. With a soft whine, Buddy turned away, leaving the man and the sandwich behind. The truck driver watched in confusion as Buddy trotted back onto the road, his head held low but his resolve unwavering. As the day wore on, Buddy's journey took him through a dense forest. The trees cast long shadows across the ground, and the air was cool and damp. For the first time in days, Buddy felt a brief sense of relief from the heat of the sun. But the forest presented new challenges. The undergrowth was thick, and Buddy had to navigate carefully to avoid getting tangled in the brambles. He paused at a shallow stream, lowering his head to drink deeply. The cold water soothed his parched throat and gave him a moment of reprieve. Suddenly, a rustling noise in the bushes made Buddy freeze. His ears perked up, and he scanned the area, his body tense. A raccoon darted out of the brush, its beady eyes locking onto Buddy before scurrying away. Buddy let out a low bark but didn't chase it. He had no energy to spare and his mission was too important. As he continued through the forest, the faint scent of smoke reached his nose. Curious and wary, Buddy followed the smell to a small campsite where a family was packing up their belongings. A young boy spotted Buddy and gasped in delight. "Mom! Dad! Look! A dog!" The boy ran toward Buddy, holding out a piece of bread from their breakfast. Buddy stopped in his tracks, his tail wagging slightly as the boy approached. He sniffed the bread cautiously before taking it gently from the boy's hand. "Can we keep him?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with excitement. The parents exchanged a glance, their expressions softening as they looked at the weary dog. "He doesn't look like he belongs out here," the father said. "Poor guy must be lost." Buddy licked the boy's hand in gratitude, But as the family discussed what to do, he turned and began to walk away. "Wait! Where are you going?" the boy called after him, but Buddy didn't stop. The father placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He must be trying to find someone," he said quietly. That night, Buddy reached the outskirts of a small town. The lights of the houses flickered like stars, and the distant hum of voices and laughter filled the air. For a moment, Buddy hesitated, unsure if he should venture further. But then a familiar scent wafted toward him, faint but unmistakable. It was Mark. Buddy's tail wagged furiously, and a burst of energy surged through him. He broke into a run, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he followed the scent. The streets blurred past him, the cool night air whipping through his fur. As he neared Mark's neighborhood, Buddy slowed, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The scent was stronger now, guiding him like a beacon. He turned onto a quiet street lined with houses, his paws pressing against the cool pavement. Finally, he saw it. Mark's house. The sight of the familiar porch and the warm glow of the living room lights filled Buddy with relief. He let out a single joyful bark, his tail wagging as he approached the front door. But something was wrong. The house was silent, and there was no sign of Mark. Buddy sniffed around the porch, his ears flicking at the faint sound of movement inside. He pawed at the door, whining softly. Inside, Mark lay on the couch, his breathing shallow and his face pale. He hadn't moved in hours, his body weak from days of neglect. Buddy barked again, louder this time, his voice filled with urgency. The bark echoed through the quiet street, catching the attention of a neighbor across the road. An elderly woman peeked out her window, her brow furrowing as she spotted the dog on the porch. "What's going on over there?" she muttered, grabbing her coat and stepping outside. Buddy barked again, turning toward the woman and then back at the door. The urgency in his eyes was unmistakable. The woman approached cautiously, her heart aching at the sight of the thin, dirty dog. "What's wrong, boy?" she asked. Buddy barked once more and scratched at the door, his movements frantic. Realizing something was wrong, the woman knocked on the door. When there was no response, she tried the handle and found it unlocked. Pushing the door open, she gasped at the sight of Mark, lying motionless on the couch. "Call 911, she shouted to her husband, who had followed her outside. Buddy barked again, pacing anxiously as the woman rushed to Mark's side. Mark's world was a blur of dim light and muffled sounds. He barely registered the commotion around him. The urgent voices, the warm touch of a hand on his forehead, the rapid beeping of a machine somewhere in the distance. A wave of weakness kept him pinned to the couch, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. The sound of a familiar bark cut through the haze, sharp and urgent. Mark's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, he thought he was dreaming. He turned his head weakly toward the door and saw Buddy standing there, his golden fur disheveled and his body trembling with exhaustion. "Buddy," Mark croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Buddy let out another bark, his tail wagging furiously as he rushed to Mark's side. The golden retriever pressed his nose against Mark's hand, whining softly, his eyes wide with relief. "Mark, stay with us." The voice of the neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, came through clearly now. She hovered nearby, holding a phone as she relayed instructions to the paramedics. Her husband, Mr. Henderson, stood in the doorway, keeping an eye on Buddy, whose every movement seemed focused on Mark. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their swift movements breaking the surreal stillness of the scene. They checked Mark's vitals, gently moving him onto a stretcher. Buddy barked in protest as they lifted Mark, his eyes darting between the strangers and his owner. "It's okay, boy," one of the paramedics said, holding out a hand to calm the anxious dog. But Buddy stayed close, his body tensed as if ready to intervene. "Let the dog come," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "He's not going to leave him." The paramedics exchanged a glance before nodding. "All right, but he needs to stay out of the way." Buddy followed closely as they carried Mark to the waiting ambulance. He leapt inside without hesitation, curling up by Mark's feet as the vehicle sped toward the hospital. Hours later, Mark awoke in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling his nostrils. He blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, his body feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. His first thought was of Buddy. Was it a dream? Had the dog really come back? As if on cue, Buddy's head popped up from the floor beside the bed, his ears perking up at the sound of Mark stirring. The golden retriever let out a low, happy bark, and placed his paws gently on the edge of the bed, his tail wagging. Mark's chest tightened, and tears welled up in his eyes. "You're really here," he whispered, reaching out to run his fingers through Buddy's fur. "You came back." Buddy licked Mark's hand, his eyes filled with the kind of unconditional love that only a dog could give. The nurse entered the room a moment later, smiling warmly at the sight of the reunion. "He hasn't left your side since you got here," she said, setting down a tray of water and medication. Mark's throat tightened with emotion. "He saved me," he said, his voice breaking. "He found me and saved me." The nurse nodded. "He must really love you." Mark glanced down at Buddy, who was now resting his head on the bed, his tail wagging softly. "I don't deserve him," Mark murmured, his voice heavy with guilt. The nurse paused, her expression softening. "Maybe," she said gently, "but he seems to think you do." As Mark began to recover, he reflected on everything that had led to this moment. He thought about the day he had abandoned Buddy, the pain in the dog's eyes, and the unwavering determination that had brought him back. It was a lesson in loyalty and forgiveness that Mark knew he would carry with him forever. By the time he was discharged from the hospital, Mark had made a promise to himself and to Buddy. He would never let his pain and fear drive him to make such a cruel decision again. Back at home, the atmosphere was different. Mark took slow steps through the living room, his body still weak but his heart feeling lighter. Buddy trotted beside him, his golden fur once again gleaming after a thorough bath. Mark picked up the old tennis ball from the floor and turned to Buddy. "Want to play?" he asked with a small smile. Buddy's ears perked up, and his tail wagged furiously as he barked in excitement. Mark laughed, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in a long time, and tossed the ball across the yard. Buddy bolted after it, his movements full of energy and joy. Watching Buddy run, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. That night, as Mark sat on the porch with Buddy at his side, he looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you." Whether it was meant for Buddy, for the universe, or for some higher power, he wasn't sure. But he knew one thing for certain: Buddy had saved his life, not just by bringing help when he needed it, but by reminding him of the strength it took to keep moving forward. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft golden light across the living room. Mark sat in his favorite armchair, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. Buddy lay sprawled at his feet, his tail gently wagging as he dozed, his golden fur glinting in the sunlight. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again. Mark gazed at Buddy, the memories of their journey together replaying in his mind. He had spent countless hours over the past few days thinking about the choices he had made, the pain he had caused Buddy, the darkness he had allowed to consume him. And yet, despite everything, Buddy had returned. "You never gave up on me, did you?" Mark said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Buddy's ears. Buddy stirred, his eyes opening just enough to look up at Mark before closing again in contentment. Over the next few weeks, Mark's recovery became as much emotional as it was physical. He began to establish a new routine, one that centered not only on his own well-being but on Buddy's too. Every morning they went for long walks through the neighborhood, Buddy trotting happily by Mark's side. The fresh air and steady rhythm of their steps seemed to clear Mark's mind, helping him see things in a new light. The neighbors, who had witnessed Buddy's loyalty firsthand, often stopped to greet them. "There's the hero," one of them called out one morning, leaning over his fence to pet Buddy. Mark chuckled, watching as Buddy wagged his tail in response. "He's more than a hero," Mark said. "He's a miracle." One afternoon, Mark sat at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of him. The pages were blank, but his mind was overflowing with thoughts. He had been avoiding the pile of bills and eviction notices for weeks, but now he felt ready to face them. "I'm not running anymore," he said aloud, glancing at Buddy, who was lying nearby with his favorite tennis ball between his paws. Mark began to jot down a plan, a list of steps he could take to get his life back on track. He reached out to a former coworker about job opportunities, scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor, and even started looking into grief counseling. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of everything threatened to pull him back into despair, but whenever he felt himself slipping, Buddy was there. The dog's quiet presence reminded him of the strength he had drawn from their bond, the resilience that had brought them both through their darkest days. As the weeks turned into months, the changes in Mark became more evident. He started smiling more, laughing at Buddy's antics as the dog chased squirrels in the yard or tried to wrestle his tennis ball free from under the couch. The house, once filled with silence and shadows, now echoed with the sounds of life. Mark also began reconnecting with old friends, people he had pushed away during his spiral of grief and self-doubt. One evening, he invited his closest friend, Sarah, over for dinner. "I almost didn't recognize you," Sarah said with a smile as they sat on the porch after the meal. "You seem lighter." Mark nodded, glancing down at Buddy, who was curled up at his feet. "I owe it all to him," he said. "He reminded me of what really matters." Sarah reached over and patted Mark's hand. "You've come a long way. And I think Emily would be proud." Mark swallowed hard, his throat tightening at the mention of his late wife. He looked up at the stars, their light twinkling in the dark sky. "I hope so," he said quietly. One particularly bright morning, Mark and Buddy set out for a walk along a wooded trail just outside of town. The path was lined with tall trees, their leaves rustling in the breeze, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of pine and moss. As they walked, Mark noticed something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The knot of anxiety that had once been a constant in his chest was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. He glanced down at Buddy, who was trotting ahead, his tail wagging. "Come on, boy," Mark called, laughing as Buddy turned and bounded back toward him. They reached a clearing at the top of a hill, where the town stretched out below them in a patchwork of rooftops and trees. Mark sat on a fallen log, taking a deep breath, as Buddy lay beside him. "This is what life's about, isn't it?" Mark said, running his hand through Buddy's fur. "Moments like this, not the mistakes, not the pain, just this." Buddy let out a soft woof, as if agreeing. That night, Mark sat on the porch with Buddy at his side, the stars shining brightly above them. He thought about how far they had both come. Buddy, who had braved miles of unknown terrain to find his way back home, and himself, who had finally found the strength to rebuild his life. Mark reached over and scratched Buddy's ears. "You saved me," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "In every way that matters, you saved me." Buddy leaned into his touch, his eyes closing in contentment. For the first time in years, Mark felt a sense of hope, not just for the future but for the present as well. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't face it alone. The sun rose early on a crisp autumn morning, casting warm golden hues across Mark's yard. Leaves danced in the breeze, scattering across the porch where Mark stood with a mug of coffee in his hands. Buddy sat at his side, his tail wagging as he watched a squirrel dart across the fence. The world seemed brighter now, not just because of the changing season, but because of the transformation both Mark and Buddy had undergone. Mark took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. He felt lighter, as though the weight of his past had finally begun to lift. He looked down at Buddy, who glanced up at him with those ever-loyal eyes, and smiled. "You ready for a new adventure, boy?" Buddy let out an excited bark, his tail wagging furiously. Later that day, Mark loaded a few items into his car: some snacks, a leash, Buddy's favorite tennis ball, and a map he had marked with a red circle around a specific destination. Buddy hopped into the passenger seat, his paws resting on the window as he eagerly surveyed the world outside. Mark glanced at him and chuckled. "You're going to love this." The drive was peaceful, the two of them falling into a comfortable rhythm of companionship. Mark hummed along to the soft music playing on the radio, and Buddy occasionally stuck his head out of the window, the wind ruffling his fur. Their destination was a small animal rescue center just outside of town. Mark had called ahead, explaining his idea to the staff, who had been thrilled to help. As they pulled into the gravel parking lot, Buddy tilted his head, curious about the new place. Inside the rescue center, the air was filled with the sounds of wagging tails, soft barks, and the gentle murmurs of staff and volunteers caring for the animals. Mark knelt beside Buddy, scratching behind his ears. "I think it's time we pay it forward, don't you?" Buddy barked softly, as though in agreement. A staff member approached with a clipboard and a warm smile. "Mr. Thompson, welcome. We've got a few dogs we think you and Buddy might like to meet." Mark nodded, his heart swelling with anticipation. He had been thinking about this moment for weeks, giving another dog the chance at a life filled with love and care, just as Buddy had given him a second chance. They were led to a grassy play area where several dogs were waiting, their tails wagging with excitement. Buddy immediately trotted forward, sniffing curiously at the other dogs. One in particular, a small timid shepherd mixed with soft brown eyes, caught Buddy's attention. The little dog hesitated at first, unsure of Buddy's larger presence, but Buddy lowered his head and wagged his tail gently, his body language calm and inviting. Slowly, the shepherd mix stepped closer, sniffing Buddy's nose before letting out a small, playful bark. Mark watched the interaction, his heart warming at the sight. "What's his name?" he asked the staff member. "Her name's Daisy," the woman replied. "She's been here for a few months. She's a bit shy, but incredibly sweet once she warms up to someone." Mark crouched down, holding out his hand for Daisy to sniff. She approached cautiously, her tail wagging tentatively. When she finally nuzzled his hand, Mark felt a swell of emotion. "Hi, Daisy," he said softly. "You want to come home with us?" The drive back home was filled with excitement. Buddy lay in the back seat next to Daisy, who curled up shyly but kept stealing glances at her new friend. Mark glanced at them through the rearview mirror and smiled. When they arrived home, Mark opened the car door, and Daisy hesitated before stepping out. Buddy gave her a reassuring nudge, and together they walked up to the porch. Mark held the door open, watching as Daisy cautiously explored her new surroundings. Over the next few weeks, Daisy settled into her new life with Mark and Buddy. She became more confident, her once timid nature replaced by a playful energy that filled the house with laughter. Mark often found her and Buddy chasing each other in the yard or napping side by side in a patch of sunlight. Mark's own life continued to improve as well. He had found a steady job at a local community center, helping others rebuild their lives, just as he had rebuilt his own. The work was fulfilling, giving him a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch with Buddy and Daisy at his feet, he reflected on how far they had all come. The journey had been difficult, marked by mistakes and heartbreak, but it had also been filled with moments of growth, resilience, and redemption. "You both saved me," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached down to scratch behind their ears, his heart full of gratitude. "I hope I can spend the rest of my life giving you the love you deserve." Buddy licked his hand, and Daisy let out a happy bark as if to say they already knew. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the yard, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. The future was uncertain, as it always was, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. He wasn't alone anymore. Together, Mark, Buddy, and Daisy had built something beautiful, a home filled with love, hope, and second chances.